Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 25th, 2022. Last week I was reporting on the conferences taking place in Washington, D.C. of financial manipulators from the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, European Union, and so on. Essentially institutions that represent global corporate cartels in finance, food, and other areas. And they were meeting at a moment of food scarcity worldwide, but they insisted on sticking to the so-called rules-based order. Now, their insistence on adherence to the rules-based order is occurring at a moment when there is shortages of food facing hundreds of millions of people. Now, the starting point for looking at this is who makes these rules of the so-called rules-based order. It's the corporate cartels in banking and finance, insurance, food cartels, and so on, big pharma. They treat food as a commodity for speculators, for traders to make money, not as a necessity for people. The American system actually has a guarantee for a floor price to protect farmers and to ensure a food supply. That was called parity, but that's been waived from the books for the last 30 years, 40 years, and now American farmers are facing loss of income, loss of property, along with European farmers who are all being hit by these cartels who insist on making a profit. Now, the other line that came out of this conference is that sanctions against Russia must continue, but that the Russians are to blame for the food shortages because of the war in Ukraine. Now, these sanctions are there to provide an excuse for regime change in Russia, because Russia does not accept the rules-based order. And in fact, Russia and China signed an agreement on February 4th of this year, before the war in Ukraine, in which they pledge to continue to work together, if necessary, to find alternatives to the collapsing financial system in the West. Now, the gatherings in Washington essentially infringed on nations' right to guarantee food security, to increase food supplies, in order to defend the so-called market economies, even at the expense of hundreds of millions of lives. Now, one of the things that occurred was there was a realignment on display. Those who represented the financial and political interests of the transatlantic nations, which are the same ones pushing for an endless war against Russia, demanded that nations stick to the rules. And these include concerns for markets and green policy. Some of these rules include bans on governments acting to ensure adequate food supply. This is an imperial policy which prevents governments from supporting their farmers and agricultural producers. It prevents governments from maintaining food reserves, undercuts their ability to export, and also destroys their ability to achieve food self-sufficiency. The World Trade Organization rules essentially say that any measures to accomplish these objectives violate their rules. They distort trade and harm farmers in other countries. Well, there's no protection for farmers in the United States and Europe. They're a victim of these rules as well. That's one of the reasons we're facing world food shortages. Now, the way this works is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, imposes what they call structural adjustment policies on any nation which is deeply in debt. And what these require is that they increase their exports, including food exports, including from countries where there's food shortages. And the reason they do this is to provide cheap food for markets in Europe and the United States. At the same time, they destroy the ability of farmers and agricultural producers in those parts of the world, North America and Europe, Western Europe, to make a living. So this is the idiocy. And it's not just idiocy, it's almost a satanic population reduction policy to defend the speculators at the expense of the people. The money from exports from these poorer countries go to give them funds to pay off their debt. And they must pay debt before they feed their people or build hospitals or schools. That's the International Monetary Fund system today. That's the rules-based order, which is defended by politicians in the United States and Western Europe. And so this leads to shortages in countries that are exporting food. Their proposal is that they produce goods that are valuable for exports, like coffee and bananas and cotton, as opposed to food supplies which are needed for their own people. That's the rules-based order. Now, India's finance minister objected to these rules. She said that the World Trade Organization rules prevent India from producing more food. In response, the promoters of these rules said that India is using the Ukraine war as an excuse to justify anti-market policies to prop up its farmers. So this is the kind of inverted world, upside-down world that we hear about from Washington, London, and Brussels. In addition to India, there were representatives from Argentina and some African nations which are being targeted for excess production, who voiced objection to the rules-based order. But on the other side, the German Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, which actually is for non-cooperation and non-development, Svenja Schulze, insisted that the rules must be followed, and the blame for hunger must be directed at Russia. So, in defense of European Union agriculture policy and U.S. Department of Agriculture policy to limit production and replace the quality food produced by farmers in the advanced sector with cheap food in poorer countries, they're saying that for example, German farmers produce too much CO2, and therefore they should be shut down. They should be limited in what they can produce. So you have the green policy and the political policy merge to ensure that people are going to starve. Now, as we've reported, the United Nations and World Food Organization officials are warning that 1.7 billion people now face food insecurity, and hundreds of millions face starvation. Now, while this is going on, governments are continuing to pour billions of dollars into weapons to the arms producers, so weapons can go into Ukraine to continue the war against Russia. One of the spokesmen for this policy is the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken. He always speaks about the importance of protecting and defending the rules-based order. And he went so far as to say it pains him to think of starving children in Afghanistan when he looks into his own children's eyes. But then he presides over the theft of Afghan government reserves, which could have been used to alleviate starvation in Afghanistan, and ensures that those children will die of hunger. That smug look on Blinken's face is the true face of the Imperial policy of the modern population reducers. And this is what they call the rules-based order. The rebellion against this is growing. We see it in terms of votes at the United Nations, where many nations are voting against increasing the sanctions against Russia. We see it in the outcry from governments all over the world who are saying, why are you so concerned about Ukraine when you ignored the mass killing that occurred because of the US and NATO in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya? So we've come to a point where this existing rules-based order is being exposed as nothing but a front for the billionaires' clubs who control the institutions that are engaged in the trading and financial warfare against poorer countries to line the pockets of the billionaires back home. But the ultimate goal is the reduction of world population. That's what the rules-based order is all about. And that's why this realignment is underway. And the Schiller Institute is at the center of organizing an alternative, not just opposition to the rules-based order, but an alternative system which has security guarantees for all nations. And among those security guarantees are a just financial system and a food production system worldwide that ensures that no child anywhere in the world goes hungry. We have a program that will provide this on the Schiller Institute page, the LaRouche program for a new financial architecture. I urge you to read it, think about it, and join us in pushing it through in every level of policy discussion. Thanks. See you tomorrow.